Any civilization needs certain things in order for it to continue to exist. Now, many scholars have focused on a lot of things such as common values, a replacement fertility rate, or a functional economic system. These are all, of course, very important, but they're not the only ones. Any civilization that does not have an outlet where frustrations can go out unfettered is a civilization ripe for being conquered, destroyed, or simply awaiting to collapse in some form of civil war. Attempting to suppress the popular frustrations entirely does not end those frustrations, it merely sends them underground enough in order for them to come out with a vengeance sometime further down the line. And it never ends well. Ever. At all. No exceptions. Or at least there is no example in history of a civilization surviving for more than 1 century after it removed all avenues for dealing with frustration. Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to the Freedom Alternative. Alright, this will hopefully be a short video because there's really just one simple idea that needs to be broadcasted. If you want to continue to have a civilization, you must have a few areas where social rules do not apply at all. Failure to ensure such areas in your civilization is a guarantee for collapse within decades. This is not a new idea, of course. It is in fact a very old idea, one that was understood and applied in Europe most of the time, and indeed worldwide for lasting civilizations. Although far from being the only factor, the lack of an outlet where frustration can be expressed and steam can be blown unfettered is arguably the single most common feature for all European societies or countries that collapsed. This goes back all the way to the Roman Empire itself. Rome started having protests by the civilians when the games were not organized. One of the reasons the games were popular was precisely because the arena was one of the places where social etiquette did not apply, and the plebs could say and indeed shout whatever the hell they wanted, and nobody would care. So basically, as it turns out, having a clear corner where steam can be blown is more or less mandatory. Now, this should not surprise anyone. Every serious intellectual and all serious institutions, including the church, have recognized this fact for centuries. You cannot eliminate evil, no matter how you define that evil, whether it's prostitution or hate speech or blasphemy or whatever. The best you can hope, no matter where you are on the political spectrum, is to minimize its impact upon the rest of your civilization. Not understanding this reality is a guarantee for your civilization to go belly up. Now let me give you 2 examples. Example number 1, the United English Emirates, oftentimes still known as the United Kingdom. That place has 2 moments in history when the airing of frustration has been killed. One was in late 12th century and early 13th century, and one is today. The previous time, the collapse was narrowly avoided by the last-minute agreement known in history to this day as the Magna Carta, which, although not immediately, gave rise to the very concept of free Englishmen and, I would argue, permanently separated Britain from its collectivistic Scandinavian background. In other words, we shouldn't really talk about Brits or indeed Englishmen before 1215, but rather the post-Viking society. Anyway, the second time this is happening in the United Kingdom is today. For the last 100 years, the traditional outlets for the discharge of frustration in the United Kingdom were the stadium, the pub, and sometimes the workplace. All three have been slowly but thoroughly dismantled over the last 20 years. The smoking ban has destroyed the institution of the British pub, with atrocious effect both on the physical and the mental health of many communities, negative effects that far outpace whatever danger the anti-smoking faggots had imagined or lied about in their propaganda. The speech codes have effectively destroyed the stadium too. Now you can be banned for shouting at the players that they play like a bunch of girls, because, you see, that's sexist, because it implies that girls suck at football by default. It doesn't matter that it's true, since even the best of the best that women's football has is still crappier in quality than even 8th league men's football. It doesn't even matter that it's not said out of hatred, but rather as an encouragement for the players. None of that matters. The traditional English stadium as a social institution is effectively dead. And finally, the HR policies, combined with the advancement of technology as well, have effectively destroyed the workplace as a potential outlet for frustration discharge, as co-workers are now more estranged than ever in terms of deep connections. And to make things worse, the corporate culture has evolved in the direction of almost forcing superficial connections between co-workers through various quasi-mandatory social events. So you now have a bunch of people who most of the time hate each other, or at the very least don't really care about each other, forced to mimic a deep connection to each other for the sake of brownie points in front of their ideologically driven human resources masters. Now, some of these things, especially the workplace part, are taking place in most other countries as well. But it is particularly the United Kingdom that is the most quote-unquote advanced in the project of thoroughly suppressing any avenue of discharging frustration. Even Sweden still has its stadium in an okay-ish state as a social institution. Now, what happens when you do this? Well, combined with other factors, such as the destruction of family, this gives you things like the London riots, or the yellow vests, or new forms of street hooliganism. You thought the hooliganism in the 1970s was bad? That would look like a walk in the park compared to what's coming. It will, for sure, get a lot worse. And the only way to stop it is to have another Magna Carta moment, namely to restore free speech, freedom of association, and with those, the avenue for frustration discharge. Now, will any of that happen before it's too late? I don't know, but if I were to bet, I would bet against it. Alright, example number 2. Communist-era Romania. After Stalin's death, most communist countries saw a relaxation in the social sphere. Far from a decent society, at the very least it wasn't completely unbearable. For a while. In fact, we can argue that the death of Stalin in 1953 was indeed a tragedy. If Stalin had stayed alive for another 10 or 15 years, things would have gotten to the unbearable point much faster, and we would have seen the end of communist rule in Europe before 1970, though at the cost of much more human lives. Anyway, back to communist Romania. From 1958 until 1980, things have gotten gradually better in the social sphere. The gulags had been shut down, artistic freedom was never restored, but artists had gotten some wiggle room that simply had not existed between 1948 and 1958, and these social institutions for the discharge of frustration were allowed to make a comeback. Far from the thriving places they used to be prior to 1948, but still far better than the Stalinist period. The institutions I'm talking about were pretty much the same as the United Kingdom in the same period: the stadium, the pub, and the family, not the workplace. And this was because the workplace was officially and institutionally politicized already by the Communist Party, which led to people looking towards the family as a safe space to vent frustration. Now, despite the official propaganda which encouraged people to rat out their relatives should they speak against the regime or the socialist order, as they were, the vast majority of the population never did. And the family remained a strong pillar in this department all the way up to mid-1980s, when the very harsh economic conditions, which are the natural result of any socialist or communist system, made families unstable. But that's a story for another day. So the regime created or appropriated pre-existent football squads that were representing various branches of the communist state: the police, the Securitate, the army, the educational establishment, and so on and so forth. Thus emerged squads that everyone loved to hate. And thus you had a perfectly manageable avenue where deep frustrations with the regime were being vented out in the public with minimal consequences for the regime, while at the same time serving this fundamental need that emerges in any civilization. Similarly, speech inside the bars was rarely, if ever, politicized, which meant that's where you would go to find out the latest real political news, since everyone knew that the official communist press was a bunch of, well, horse manure. Now, this balance was good enough to keep the seriously dangerous dissidents quite marginal and maintain a level of societal stability that could keep things going. This balance started to go down after 1978, in part because of a natural event, namely the March 4th, 1977 earthquake, which made quite a bit of damage, but also because of the regime's incompetence and indeed stupidity in dealing with the fallout. So while in 1975 it was still perfectly kosher to call the militia squad a club of thieves that should kiss our asses in the stadium, that became an offense for which you'd get arrested in 1981. By 1984, respectable non-political sports journalists were being turned into non-persons for daring to suggest that an international transfer of a certain player is a good idea. What was the result of that? Well, you've all seen it in 1989, as we had the first ever regime change to be live broadcasted worldwide on TV. The stadium and the bar quite literally moved into the streets and then into the party's headquarters and the head of state's office. Now, I'm not saying that the destruction of the avenues for venting frustration was the main reason. It wasn't. The lack of food was the main driver. I mean, seriously, just don't mess with our food. But if you do, expect to be either impaled or helicoptered or shot or all three of them. And no, I'm not joking. What I am saying is that the suppression of frustration venting was the tipping point. Now, why am I telling these stories? Well, because collectively, we are committing the same mistake. And I say committing a mistake because those who attempt to implement know exactly what they're doing. They may not be aware of the result down the line of the policy, but the objective is upfront, to undermine the avenues of venting frustration. This is very dangerous stuff. Over the last 20 years, some intentional but also some non-intentional changes have occurred. The family, where it still exists, is less of a relevant institution for frustration venting than it used to be in the past. While my generation would discuss these things with their fathers, the next generation either outright doesn't have fathers, or they have already been over-socialized to the point they don't even consider it an option. This is especially true in northwestern Europe as well as most of North America, where being close to your parents is regarded as something shameful by your peers. That's not to say that the Italian model is great, where youngsters stay close, including physically close, to their parents way into their 40s, but encouraging the complete cutting of ties with the parents after the age of 18 or 20 means one loses the opportunity to discuss and air frustrations with the only people on the planet who have a duty to give a shit about your frustrations. The pub has also died as a social institution almost everywhere. The stadium is also more or less dead because of excessive politicization. And to make things worse, there's also competing frustration in the form of mass immigration of very young people from a competing civilization. The church is also essentially gone. 50 years ago, one would still discuss privately and air frustrations with the priest. Nowadays, the church is more feminist and leftist than the fucking politicians. So what's left? Well, there's still video games, portions of the internet, and some private clubs, and that's it. And all three are under heavy attack precisely for this reason, because they allow unfettered frustration to be discharged. If this is to succeed in full, get ready for a very rough journey. Because all of these people, especially the young men, will suddenly realize that there's no point in playing nice. This has already partially happened with Gamergate, but it so far happened in a very tamed way. For all intents and purposes, the legacy of Gamergate is a few 100,000 new people, maybe 1 million worldwide, who have at least taken the time to listen to a point of view that is not from the far, far left. For all intents and purposes, these scandals have remained marginal enough and did not create serious troubles, which is a good thing. But all of that can change really fast and turn really nasty if the current trends continue. Take away unfettered internet, video games, and ban all unlicensed private clubs. The result of that is exactly one: violence. Revolutionary violence, to be more precise, on a scale likely not seen so far, or at the very least comparable with one of the world wars. You don't have to believe me, but just think about it. Who tends to spend a disproportionate amount of time on the internet and playing video games? It's young people, predominantly young men, but I'll deal with that in another video. Who tends to kickstart and fight revolutions? Those exactly the same frustrated young people. This has been true in 100% of the cases of revolutions so far. Older people may be ideologues in the revolution, they may be the strategists, or may be financing the revolutionary effort, but the actual fighting is always done by young people. This makes perfect sense, since they are at the peak of their physical abilities. Now, if you think this isn't dangerous, you haven't been paying attention. Every civilization is being periodically invaded by barbarians that need to be integrated really fast. Those barbarians are called children. When you fail to do that, and on top of that you bring even more physically excellent individuals from competing civilizations, that's a nice recipe for a revolution. Now, I can go even deeper into it and remind everyone that Islam is far friendlier with young men than most of the Western civilization at this point in history, and that any revolutionary force, especially of the violent variety, recruits first and foremost from amongst the disaffected youth, who feels that their very nature is being suppressed and there is no avenue to even express that disaffection. And when you take that into consideration, things can get really ugly really fast, all because you've cut out all of the avenues meant for venting. So, to sum it up, at stake is not, or it is not just, the revenue of whatever YouTube personality. One can rightly say that it's not a terrible loss if whatever YouTube personality stops making videos. At stake is the wider situation. Take away the avenue for venting frustration and the civilization will have a much bigger problem on its hands. And I say this especially for the left-wingers who sometimes watch this channel. What I have said so far in this video is applicable no matter what your opinion or my opinion is about how things should be. I'm merely telling you how things are. Not taking this element into consideration is very dangerous. You may think that quote-unquote online hate speech is a bad thing, but attempting to suppress it will, for sure, bring out really nasty stuff, including in your house. An outlet for venting frustration is one of the pillars of civilizational balance. Mess with that, and you stand a chance of messing the entirety of the civilizational balance. Now, you feel free to disagree. I'm not going to personally pay the price for this, as I made sure to have my own safe space, but millions upon millions of people will, for sure, pay the price of the recklessness and the wrong-headedness of the policymakers and ideologues who push really hard for abolishing or subverting the society's valves for frustration. In a future video, I will go specifically on men, because it is men who have all the reasons already right now to kickstart a revolution. And it really does depend whether that revolution will be slow and mostly peaceful, or if it will be violent and messy. And one of the things this depends on is whether frustration can still be aired unfettered or not. Alright, that's it for now. Let me know what you think. If you think I'm overestimating the importance of institutions for venting, please explain to me in great detail why you think they're less important. So far, I have yet to hear or read about an example of a society where frustration has been suppressed and things didn't go really wrong within a few decades. Also, please do keep in mind that the internet has accelerated things. An argument that used to take, a societal argument that used to take 70 to 100 years can now be decided in 10 years. Because of the speed of information, centuries are now decades in civilizational terms. This is oftentimes great, but if you suppress frustration, you may not have to wait a century to see the result. 20 years should be more than enough. Anyway, with all of that being said, thank you all for watching. Thank you for your continuous and generous support. Please do consider giving a shekel if you derive any value from the work being done here. Please do subscribe to my social media, and I will see you all soon on the Freedom Alternative.